Her baby was taken as debt payment until a mountain man rode into town at noon asterisk. The winter sun had barely climbed over the jagged mountain ridge when Mara Ellison stepped outside her small log cabin. A thin shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders. Frost clung to every surface, glittering like broken glass across the ground. The world seemed still and quiet, but Mara's heart beat with constant restlessness. She had been living on the edge of fear ever since her husband, Owen, passed away 6 months earlier, leaving behind a debt she had never known existed. She leaned against the wooden rail of the porch, rocking her infant son, Noah, who was bundled in a quilt she had stitched with trembling hands during sleepless nights. He cooed softly, unaware of the storm gathering on the horizon. Mara had spent every waking hour trying to keep up with the demands of Silas Crowder, the most feared debt collector in the region. Silas had a reputation for cruelty disguised as business. He smiled with his mouth but never his eyes, and everyone in town knew that once Silas claimed something, he never gave it back without extracting terrible payment. Mara had been giving him whatever she could scrape together from selling eggs, mending clothes, and working long shifts at the mill, but it was never enough. The debt he claimed Owen owed kept growing with interest she didn't understand and couldn't challenge. She had begged Silas for more time, but he had offered only warnings, each harsher than the last. That morning, Mara sensed something wrong in the air. Even the birds were silent. Noah stirred in her arms, fussing as if he too felt the shift in the wind. She kissed his tiny forehead and tried to calm her rising panic. She had planned to ride into town later that day to plead once more for mercy, but before she could take another step, she heard the crunch of heavy boots approaching along the frozen path. Her blood went cold. Silas Crowder emerged through the thin veil of mist like a specter. His black coat trailed behind him, and 2 of his men followed closely. Mara felt her knees weaken, but she forced herself to stand tall. She tightened her hold on Noah as Silas stepped onto the porch, removing his hat as though paying her respect, though the smirk on his face showed anything but politeness. "Well now, Mrs. Ellison," he drawled, eyeing her as though she were livestock being inspected. "It appears your payment for this month hasn't found its way to my office." Mara swallowed hard. "Please, Mr. Crowder, I'm trying. The mill cut my hours last week, but I'll make up the difference. Just give me a little more time." Noah has been sick, and Silas raised a gloved hand to silence her. "Time," he repeated, pacing slowly across her porch. "You've had 6 months of time. And compassion, unfortunately, does not pay debts." Mara felt tears sting her eyes. "I only need a little longer. I can work more shifts. I can sell what?" Silas cut in sharply. "This cabin? It wouldn't cover half of what your dear husband owed me." Silas's gaze dropped to the baby in her arms, and Mara instinctively took a step back. A cold smile spread across his face. "Collateral comes in many forms," he said quietly. Mara's breath caught. No, you can't mean. I can and I do. The boy will stay with me until your debt is paid." He snapped his fingers, and his men stepped forward. Mara let out a cry so raw it shook the winter air. "Please, he's all I have left. He's just a baby. Take anything else, but not him." Silas's eyes hardened. "Refusal will only make matters worse. You owe me, Mrs. Ellison. Today, I collect." Before she could run, before she could shield Noah with her own body, Silas's men pried the baby from her desperate grasp. Noah screamed, reaching for his mother as Mara fell to her knees, clawing at the frozen earth. She begged, she pleaded, but her voice broke against Silas's iron will. Silas turned away with Noah in his arms. "You have 30 days, he called over his shoulder. "Pay the debt, or the boy stays with me permanently." As horse hooves faded into the distance, Mara collapsed on the porch, her sobs echoing through the empty valley. The world had taken much from her already, her husband, her security, her peace, but losing Noah felt like losing her soul. She had no money, no allies, no power. But as she wiped away her tears, a spark of something fierce flickered within her. She would get her baby back, no matter what it cost. High above the valley where Mara Ellison lived, the mountains rose like ancient guardians, their slopes covered in thick pines and tangled brush. Few people traveled into those heights willingly, and even fewer returned with stories worth telling. But somewhere in that rough wilderness lived Jonas Hawley, a man who had made the mountains both his refuge and his prison. Jonas was known in whispers, a figure who stayed away from towns, from people, from memories that still carved scars deeper than the ones on his skin. Years ago he had lost his wife and daughter to a winter sickness that swept through the region. He had blamed himself for not reaching help in time, and the guilt drove him away from civilization. The mountains gave him silence, and he convinced himself that silence was enough. On the morning after Silas Crowder took Mara's baby, Jonas was tracking a wounded elk near a frozen creek. His breath rose in white clouds as he followed the animal's faint trail, but something unexpected caught his eye. The tracks of a horse, wandering aimlessly, weaving in strange patterns as though the animal was disoriented or injured. Jonas slowed, instincts sharpening. A lone horse in the mountains usually meant trouble. He followed the tracks over a ridge until he found Mara's exhausted mare standing in a thicket, trembling and favoring one leg. Her reins were tangled in a broken branch, and her saddle had slipped halfway off her body. Jonas approached with careful steps, murmuring softly to calm the frightened animal. He noticed something tied to the saddle horn, a scrap of parchment fluttering weakly in the wind. He untied it and unfolded the paper, expecting a message from a careless hunter or a traveler needing help. Instead, he froze as he read the words scrawled in rushed, shaky handwriting. "Please help me. They took my baby. I don't know where else to turn. My name is Mara Ellison. If anyone finds this, please help me save my son." Jonah's breath caught in his throat. The ink was smeared as though the paper had been clutched by desperate hands. He read the message again, slower this time, absorbing each plea. The pain in those words cut through him with startling force. It reminded him of nights when he had begged fate to spare his own daughter, nights when grief had screamed inside him with no one to hear. He looked at the mare again and saw the dried tears on her face. The animal had been ridden hard, far beyond her strength. Jonas untangled the reins and gently stroked her neck. This horse had come from the valley below, and whoever sent her must have been desperate beyond measure. Jonas scanned the surroundings, searching for any sign of the rider, but the message suggested Mara had sent the horse away intentionally, hoping it would reach someone who might help. Jonas stood still for a long moment, the weight of his choices pressing against him like heavy snowfall. He had avoided people for years. He had avoided their problems, their needs, their expectations. The world had taken everything from him, and he had walked away from it without looking back. But Mara's message felt like a hand reaching into the darkness he had built around himself. A mother begging for help. A child in danger. Jonas knew what it felt like to lose a child. He knew the hollow ache that lived in the chest where love used to be. He closed his eyes and exhaled, letting the cold mountain air fill his lungs. He had told himself he would never risk his heart again. But some instincts ran deeper than fear. Protecting a child, defending the helpless, standing against men like Silas Crowder, these were things Jonas had once lived for before tragedy turned him into a ghost. Slowly he untied the saddle from the mare and adjusted it back into place. He checked her injured leg and determined she could walk if he guided her gently. Then he looked toward the narrow path leading down the mountain. The sun was rising higher now, casting pale gold across the trees. Jonas tightened the reins in his hand and made his decision. He would ride into town. He would find Mara Ellison, and if her child had been taken, he would not let her fight alone. At high noon, the quiet mountain man would return to the world he had abandoned, answering the plea of a stranger who had nowhere else to turn. The town of Briar Hollow sat quiet under the midday sun, its dusty main road stretching between weather-beaten storefronts and leaning wooden fences. People moved slowly in the heat, going about chores with the silent weariness of those who had learned not to expect much from life. Yet on this day something felt different, a kind of tension in the air that made shopkeepers pause and ranch hands glance toward the distant trail that wound down from the mountains. Whispers drifted from porch to porch that someone unusual was coming. Someone they had not seen in years. As the courthouse clock approached noon, the town's quiet murmur faded into stillness. A young boy perched on a fence post shaded his eyes and squinted toward the ridge. "Something's moving up there," he said, his voice unusually hushed. Others followed his gaze. A dark shape appeared where the trail met the last rise above the valley. At first it looked like a shadow, then like a rider, and finally like a man carved from the very mountains behind him. Jonas Heil descended the trail on his massive buckskin stallion, moving with the steady confidence of someone who did not fear what waited below. Jonas had not set foot in Briar Hollow in nearly a decade. Many remembered him only as a rumor, a quiet man who once had a family and then lost everything. But now as he rode down the main street, people stepped aside instinctively, drawn to him with a mix of awe and curiosity. His presence felt like something ancient had come to life, a force that did not belong to towns or dust-covered roads but had chosen, for today, to walk among them. Jonas ignored the stares and whispers. His eyes were fixed on the sheriff's office at the end of the street, a squat wooden building with a crooked star nailed to the door. Sheriff Harlan stood outside waiting, arms folded across his chest. He was a weary man with a thinning beard and a conscience constantly at war with his fear of Silas Crowder. He swallowed hard as Jonas dismounted, the stallion snorting and pawing the ground. Jonas looked taller than Harlan remembered, or perhaps it was the certainty in his posture that made him seem unbreakable. Harlan forced a smile that didn't convince even himself. "Jonas Hawley," he greeted stiffly. "Didn't expect to ever see you down from the mountains again." "I'm not here for pleasantries," Jonas said. His voice was calm but held an edge that made Harlan shift uneasily. "I'm looking for a woman named Mara Ellison. Her baby was taken. I want to know by who." Harlan rubbed the back of his neck and sighed. "Jonas, listen. You don't want to get involved in this. Silas Crowder runs the debts in this town. The law can't do much against contracts, and Mara's situation is complicated." Jonas stepped closer, and Harlan felt the weight of a man who had stood against storms and wild beasts without flinching. "A baby was taken," Jonas repeated. "Tell me where he is." Harlan looked away. "Silas has him. Says it's legal. Says she owes him more than she can pay." His voice weakened. "Jonas, I can't stop Silas. He's too powerful, and half the town depends on him for loans. If you push him, he'll come after you too." Jonas didn't blink. "He can try." The sheriff exhaled a defeated breath. "Mara's at Mrs. Penwick's boarding house. Poor woman hasn't slept since yesterday. She wants to see you if you're really here to help." Jonas nodded once. He mounted his horse again and turned toward the lower end of town. As he rode, people watched from behind curtains and doorways. Children stood barefoot in the dust, sensing something important was unfolding. Women paused with baskets in their arms, studying Jonas with hope they didn't dare voice. Mara was sitting on the boarding house steps, hands clasped tightly in her lap as though holding herself together. Her face was pale, her eyes red from crying, yet she carried a quiet strength that refused to break even under the weight of her grief. When she saw Jonas approaching, she rose slowly, gripping the railing to steady herself. She had sent her message into the mountains with no expectation it would ever be found, let alone answered. Jonas stopped in front of her and dismounted. For a moment they simply looked at each other as though measuring the truth in each other's eyes. Mara spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "You came." Jonas nodded. "I found your horse. I read your message." Her breath trembled. "Will you help me?" Jonas met her gaze with a steady certainty that felt like a promise carved in stone. "Yes," he said. "I will bring your baby back." The sun dipped lower in the sky as Jonas Hawley walked beside Mara Ellison toward Silas Crowder's establishment, a looming building that cast a long shadow across the dusty street. Part saloon, part gambling den, part private office, it was the closest thing Briar Hollow had to a fortress. The wooden planks were freshly painted in a dark stain, the windows covered with heavy curtains that let no daylight in. Every time Mara approached this place, her stomach twisted with fear. But today she had Jonas beside her, and that made each step feel a little steadier. Still, her heart pounded fast enough to shake her ribs. Silas Crowder's men lounged near the doors, armed and grinning as if daring anyone to challenge their authority. When they saw Jonas approaching, their expressions shifted. Some stiffened. Others whispered his name like an unwelcome ghost had returned. Jonas did not slow, did not look left or right. His stride was even and unshaken. Mara followed behind him, clutching the edge of her shawl so tightly her knuckles turned pale. Inside, the saloon smelled of whiskey, cigar smoke, and old wooden floors. Men playing cards went silent as Jonas entered. The piano player stopped mid-note. Every pair of eyes watched as he crossed the room with calm determination. Silas Crowder sat behind a polished desk at the far end, a glass of expensive whiskey in one hand. His smile widened when he saw Mara approach, but it faltered slightly at the sight of Jonas Hollis standing beside her. "Well now," Silas said, swirling his drink lazily, "if it isn't the mountain legend. I never expected you to crawl back into civilization." He put the glass down and leaned forward. "What brings you to my door today?" Jonas did not bother with small talk. "You took a child from his mother. You'll return him." A ripple of tension moved across the room. Silas raised a brow with exaggerated amusement. "Is that so? And who exactly do you think you are to make such demands in my establishment?" "Mara's friend," Jonas answered. "And the man who won't leave here without her baby." Mara flinched slightly as the room darkened with hostility. Silas's men shifted in their seats, hands hovering near pistols. Silas himself remained seated, but his eyes sharpened. "Mrs. Ellison owes a debt," he said smoothly. "A large debt. And until it's paid, her son stays with me. The law backs every paper I have." Jonas stepped closer until he stood directly before the desk. "The law doesn't allow you to steal children." Silas leaned back with a chilling smile. "Steal is a harsh word. I call it holding collateral. Perfectly legal. And if she fails to pay, well, the boy will grow up in a fine home." He shrugged. "Better than this shabby little cabin she calls a life." Mara's breath shook with rage and humiliation. Jonas placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, grounding her. "I'll pay the debt," Jonas said. Silas blinked, surprised. Then he laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "You? You think you can afford it? This isn't a handful of coins for supplies. It's a debt grown with years of interest." "I didn't say anything about coins," Jonas replied. "Name your price." Silas studied him closely. He saw the scars on Jonas's knuckles, the calm strength in his eyes, the wild resilience of a man who had survived more than most. Silas tapped his fingers on the desk, thinking. A slow smile formed. "You want to play hero?" Fine, but this debt is worth more than money now. If you want the baby back, you'll earn him." Mara gasped. "Silas, please, haven't you taken enough? This is cruelty." Silas ignored her, eyes locked on Jonas. "I propose a challenge. Something fair." His grin widened. "Or at least fair to me. You complete a task of my choosing. Succeed, and the child is yours. Fail, and you leave town and never interfere again." Jonas didn't blink. "What's the task?" Silas took a long moment before answering, savoring the suspense. "You will cross Dead Man's Gorge before sundown tomorrow. Retrieve the marker from the opposite cliff and bring it back to me. Alone. No help. Many have tried over the years. Few return." The room stirred uneasily. Dead Man's Gorge was notorious for swallowing the brave and foolish alike. Mara stepped forward, voice trembling. "No, Jonas, it's suicide. He's trying to kill you." Jonas turned to her gently. "You want your son back?" She nodded, tears gathering at the corners of her eyes. "Then I'll do it," he said quietly. Silas clapped once, delighted. "Excellent. Then let tomorrow decide everything." As they left the saloon, Mara looked up at Jonas, her voice breaking. "I never meant for anyone to risk their life for me." Jonas met her gaze with calm certainty. "You're not alone anymore. And I don't break promises."
Dawn crept over Briar Hollow in muted shades of gold and gray, casting long shadows across the jagged cliffs that marked the path to Dead Man's Gorge. Mara Ellison stood outside the boarding house, wrapped in a thin shawl as the chilly morning breeze nipped at her skin. She barely slept, haunted by visions of Jonas poured to steps. Jonas arrived quietly, leading his buckskin stallion by the reins he had prepared before anyone else in town had risen, gathering ropes, gear, and water. He looked calm, but in his eyes Mara saw something deeper than bravery. An acceptance of danger and a determination that refused to bend. "You still have time to walk away," Mara whispered, though she knew he would at Marston. Jonas shook his head. "Your boy doesn't have time," he answered. "This ends today." The path to Dead Man's Gorge wound through thick pines and steep inclines. Jonas walked ahead, while Mara rode behind him for part of the way, unable to let him go without at least accompanying him to the base of the cliffs. As they traveled, the forest thinned, and the sound of rushing water echoed faintly. The closer they came, the more the land changed. Trees grew sparse, boulders became jagged, and the wind carried the eerie howl of the gorge's depths. When they reached the edge, Mara's breath caught. The gorge spread before them like a wound carved into the earth, its walls plunging sharply into swirling icy rapids far below. On the opposite cliff, barely visible, was the small iron marker Silas Crowder had installed years ago. Many believed Silas used the gorge as entertainment, daring reckless men to attempt the crossing in exchange for favors. Few ever returned. Jonas surveyed the landscape with deliberate calm. He tied his stallion to a tree and checked the rope slung across his shoulder. "This is madness," Mara said, her voice cracking. "He wants you dead." Jonas turned to her. "Silas wants anyone who resists him dead. But fear is how he wins. Today it ends." He rested her bend. "I'll come back. Hold on to that." Before she could protest, Jonas stepped onto the first narrow ledge. The wind whipped violently, tearing at his coat and pushing dust off the cliff edge. Jonas braced himself, gripping the rock with strong, steady hands. Every movement was deliberate. He had traversed dangerous terrain in the mountains before, but nothing like this. The gorge was unpredictable, shaped by centuries of landslides, storms, and crumbling stone below him. The water roared like thunder trapped between walls of stone. A single misstep would send him plunging into the icy depths. He carefully tested each foothold, gripping the rope he anchored to a thick tree root earlier. Mara watched from above, heart pounding with every shift of his weight. Several times rocks slipped beneath him, crashing into the churning water below. Each time Jonas paused, found a new anchor point and continued. Sweat trickled down his temples despite the cold wind. Halfway across, he reached the most dangerous portion. A broken slab extended only a few inches from the cliff face, forcing Jonas to press flat against the wall. The rope stretched taut as he moved sideways, inch by inch. The wind surged suddenly, almost pitching him forward. Mara gasped, covering her mouth. Jonas dug his fingers into the stone, teeth clenched, waiting for the wind to settle. When it did, he pushed forward again, driven by the image of Mara's grief-stricken face and the tiny baby waiting desperately for rescue. Reaching the opposite cliff felt like emerging into sunlight after drowning. Jonas pulled himself over the edge, lungs burning. He rested only a moment before crossing to the iron marker. It was rusted, cold, and bolted tightly into stone. Jonas unfastened it with trembling hands. When it finally came loose, triumph. But the journey back was even harder. His body ached, and the sun had begun to sink lower. Shadows stretching across the gorge. Mar's voice carried faintly across the gap, calling encouragement whenever he paused. Each step felt heavier, yet Jonas refused to let exhaustion slow him. With the last of his strength, he climbed the final ledge and collapsed onto solid ground. Mara ran to him, tears streaming down her face. When Jonas looked up, she saw the same unbreakable determination in his eyes. He had done the impossible. He had survived the trial Silas designed to kill him, and now, with the marker in hand, he was ready to bring her baby home. Jonas Hale and Mara Ellison returned to Briar Hollow just before sunset, the sky streaked with deep orange and violet. Word of Jonas's impossible feat had already swept across town long before they arrived. People stepped out of their homes, gathering along the main street as though witnessing the return of a long-lost hero. Even those who had once bowed to Silas Crowder's power now felt something stirring inside them, a quiet hope they had not dared feel in years. Jonas walked with steady, unhurried steps, the iron marker clutched in his hand, rust flaking against his palm. Mara stayed close beside him, her shawl fluttering in the warm breeze, her heart pounding with fear Ented did not yet dare name. Silas's saloon loomed ahead, its windows glowing with lamplight. Jonas pushed the door open, and the room fell silent. Silas himself stood near the bar, mid-conversation, but froze as soon as he saw Jonas. His eyes widened for a fraction of a second before hardening into a mask of displeasure. No one had ever returned from Dead Man's Gorge with that marker. No one was meant to. Jonas stepped forward and dropped the metal piece onto Silas's desk with a heavy clank that echoed through the tense room. "I completed your task," Jonas said, his voice calm but impenetrable. Mara stood behind him, her hands trembling as she waited for the moment she had dreamed of and feared would never come. Silas stared at the marker as though refusing to believe what he saw. Finally he looked up, jaw clenched. "You must have cheated," he muttered. "Nonan crosses that gorge and returns." Jonas didn't move. "I crossed it." "Bring the child." Silas' men shifted nervously. Some stepped back, unwilling to stand too close to the man who had just conquered the gorge that swallowed others whole. Silas's pride battled with the growing unease in the room. He wanted to refuse, to twist the deal, to find a way to punish Jonas for making him look weak. But the townspeople were watching. Even the sheriff had stepped inside, his hand resting lightly on his holstered gun, silently warning Silas to choose his next words carefully. Silas narrowed his eyes and called to one of his men. "Fetch the baby." Mara's breath caught, her fingers curled tightly around the edge of her shawl. Holding her heart screamed for her child. Minutes passed like hours before the man returned with a small bundled infant in his arms. Noah whimpered softly, confused and exhausted. Mara let out a sob that tore through the room like a crack in stone. She rushed forward, arms trembling as she reached for her son. The moment he was returned to her chest, she held him fiercely, burying her face again long been denied. Noah answered her with a tiny cry that broke every heart in the room except Silas with said, "Release your claim. Put it in writing." Silas glared at him. "You think you can dictate how I run my business?" Jonas leaned forward. "Play deal. Write it." Silas hesitated, then snatched a pen. His handwriting was sharp and slashing as he wrote the release, each stroke fueled by anger. When he finished, Jonas snatched the paper, folded it, and handed it to Mara. She clutched it with her free hand, relief flooding every part of her soul. That the moment she thought it was over, Silas spoke again. "You may have won this round," he spat. "But you don't get to walk in here, humiliate me, and leave unscarred." He reached for his pistol. The room tensed instantly. Jonas moved before anyone else could react. In one swift motion, he swung it hard. It slammed into Silas's arms, sending the gun skidding across the floor. Silas stumbled backward, crashing into his whiskey cabinet. Jonas advanced, eyes burning with a fury he had not unleashed in years. Jonas said the sheriff stepped in then, hand raised. "For kidnapping, you're under arrest for extortion, and for violating every decent law this town still has." It was the first time the sheriff had ever stood against Silas. The room erupted in murmurs of shock and then approval. Silas was seized by 2 deputies, his shouts of protest drowned by the voices of townsfolk who had finally found the courage to speak. Mara turned to Jonas, tears shining in her eyes. "You saved us," she whispered. Jonas shook his head. "You saved yourself. I just helped you stand." As night settled over Briar Hollow, Jonas walked Mara and Noah home. For the first time in a long while, the valley felt safe, and in that quiet moment Mara realized something she had never expected to feel again. Hope had returned with the mountain man who rode into town at noon.